And welcome back. I think people will be coming in from lunch, and fortunately we don't have any kind of waiting room on this session, so they'll just sneak right in. And I just wanted to introduce Iain. He's originally from Scotland, now lives in Gifu. He's the author of 3 novels, a haiku collection, a memoir, and a new novella, Life is Elsewhere, Burn Your Flags. I love that title. And has been around these conferences for some time, and so we know we can depend on him to do a great presentation today. So welcome, Iain, and you can take it away.
Thank you for that, and thank you for heaping the pressure on me. No worries there. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation thing, some slides, because looking at my face for 50 minutes is no fun for anyone. So I will just share that and get going. There we go. Hopefully you can see that slide of Lucy. So yes, thank you, Karen, for that introduction. When I pitched this originally, my intention was to talk quite a lot about my new book, and I've sort of over the months got more and more sidetracked, but I'm still sticking to the title and to the original abstract. The writing process, autocomposting, and the writer's block. Autocomposting is an odd word that I hadn't come across until very recently, so I will explain that in due course. As I say, this has evolved a lot over the months since I pitched this to John and Karen. The last thing I intended initially was to spend an hour talking about the creative process. But once I started writing this and pulling the notes together, it sort of got away from me. The last couple of years under lockdown during the pandemic, that has been kind of difficult for everyone, and I've had it pretty easy. I live in the countryside. It's, you know, social distancing is quite easy in Gifu, but it's also been, for me, it has been a period of sort of intense introspection and self-analysis. I don't know whether this has something to do with me entering my 40s or not. Who can tell? I haven't bought a sports car or bought a leather jacket, so I don't know if I'm actually having a midlife crisis or not. Who can tell? A lot of things that have been bugging me for the last couple of decades, though, came to a head with the lockdown when I had time and space to think and to work through them. And this talk about the writing process and about creativity and about the problem with writing advice in general sort of grew out of that. It also grew out of years working as an editor, a fiction editor mainly, a job which forces you to rationalize and explain what creativity, storytelling, and literature mean to you. Like, you can't tell a writer where they're going wrong if you don't have a pretty good idea of how to make it right. So the last few years have been sorting out that process in my head. It also grew out of a sense of disappointment with the creative writing masters I did years ago, a disappointment that is entirely based in my own expectations, not the course itself, not the education I got. So in short, I've been doing a sort of creative stock take, and this talk is part of that, a look at how writing advice sometimes can be more damaging than helpful. The internet and bookshops, the world in general, is awash with writers telling other writers how they should be writing. For every Hemingway quote about writing, there's a Hemingway quote about writing that says the opposite. I'm even doing it myself today, kind of. Writing, particularly writing fiction, is not good for the mental health. It's a solitary activity, and one that involves delving into parts of yourself that would usually be locked off, mining your past and your subconscious for events, characters, experiences. It involves multiple acts of empathy as you put yourself in the position of those suffering heartache, grief, trauma, fear, even impending death. Oops, hang on, my slides are not doing what I want them to do. There we go. After finishing each novel, Virginia Woolf would take to her bed with nervous exhaustion. Each novel took something from her. In the end, after completing Between the Acts, she killed herself. Whether her mental illness gave rise to her art or her art exacerbated her mental illness, or whether the connection between the two was correlative rather than causative is not for me to say. I only know that when I read Woolf on how writing took it out of her, I can, in a small, thankfully very small extent, understand what she's saying. Writers rarely come to their subjects head on, and I am no different. Murakami has a book called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. Novelist David Mitchell said that when a writer writes about music, they're really writing about writing. His second novel was named after a John Lennon song. His third featured a composer and a suite that echoed through the centuries. And his latest is about a band. So I guess he really knows what he's talking about. When I want to talk about writing, I end up talking about stand-up comedy. One podcast I regularly listen to is Stuart Goldsmith's The Comedian's Comedian. Goldsmith is a British stand-up who started the podcast because he was gripped by anxiety, a terrible fear that he was doing it wrong. Judging by the demand or the popularity of books that give advice to writers, I can only conclude that many writers, indeed many of us here today, maybe understand this feeling. Why do I find this so hard? Am I doing it wrong? Others seem to find this so much easier. Goldsmith suspected that perhaps other comedians knew some secret that was being kept from him. He figured if he interviewed enough comedians about their technique, hard, dry questions about whether they write on paper or computer, use notes apps or voice memos, whether they start from a punchline and work back or start from a situation and mine it. If he accumulated enough data, a pattern might emerge. I suspect this is what many of us feel as writers. There must be a better way, an easier way, a correct way of doing this. And if only I read enough books, listen to enough presentations, attend enough masterclasses, the secret will be revealed. I also suspect that you can already guess where this is going. I've thought this myself. Today, after this talk, I'm followed by Suzanne Kamata, one of the most prolific writers I know. Seemingly every other week, she has a new story, a new book, a new paper, as well as a job, a family. I honestly don't know how she does it. She must know the secret. I've been accused of this myself. I published 4 books in 3 years between 2014 and 2016. I published last year and this year. People have called me prolific. I don't feel that way, and I certainly have no universal secret. What feels like hard work can look like ease to others. There's a romanticism surrounding writing that causes anxiety to writers. I've had writers say to me, if I knew it would be this hard, I'd never have started. One of the most positive things about the last couple of decades of social media is the increasing openness people feel when it comes to sharing their troubles. Depression, anxiety, dreams, and fears. And it is a trend that I welcome, something I wish had existed when I was younger. It's a trend that has brought us everything from the Comedian's Comedian podcast to the Me Too movement. One of the most talked about things recently in creative social media is imposter syndrome. It's what Goldsmith had, in a sense. Everyone else knows what they are doing, and I am faking it. When Armando Iannucci made The Thick of It and Veep set in the corridors of power, he learned that everyone there had imposter syndrome too. Politicians, bureaucrats, policy advisors. They had no idea what they were doing and assumed that someone else somewhere did. It's how we know conspiracy theories are not true. If even the people with actual power have no idea what they're doing or what's going on, I think it's safe to conclude that no one does. And that gives me real comfort. Anxiety and imposter syndrome are things I struggled with, but over time I came to a realization that helped me get over, to an extent, these problems. As people opened up about their own imposter syndrome, it was the people I most looked up to, the people I most respected, that said they felt they were lost in the dark. Conversely, the people who are actual imposters, people who have shown again and again that they are unqualified, unfit for the positions they hold, seemingly have endless confidence and would certainly never admit to anxiety about it. My conclusion was simple, but for me anyway, powerful. Imposters don't feel imposter syndrome. The people you respect do. Therefore, if you honestly feel imposter syndrome, then you are not an imposter. Your anxiety is proof that you are doing exactly what you should be doing. Creating art means giving yourself permission to be yourself. And if that doesn't make you anxious, step away from the paints, the paper, and the camera. Today, I want to talk about that anxiety and some techniques I've developed over the years to deal with it, techniques that often fly in the face of the usual advice to artists, especially writers. While this talk may look like advice, it's more along the lines of my advice is ignore all the advice. Paradoxical, sure, but then all art is paradoxical. Over the years, and this includes doing a master's in creative writing and 95% of a PhD in creative writing and working as a professional editor, I've heard countless pieces of advice, but the three most commonly recurring can be summarized as follows. Number one, kill your darlings. Number two, get a draft done. And number three, sit down and write, damn you. Let's look at the first one. Roughly taken, it means don't be precious about your writing. A sentence, a scene, a chapter, even an entire character may be the single best thing you've ever written. But if it isn't pulling its weight in the story, poem, script, then delete it. Be ruthless, be brutal, be utilitarian. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The story comes first. If a chapter must die so that others may live, then so be it. Generally, this is very good advice, particularly for novelists. Novels are what Michael Hallquist called a baggy monster. On average, a novel is 80,000 words with multiple characters, subplots, and themes. When you're on page 1, you have no idea what page 247 will look like. You have no idea what is going to become relevant and what isn't. This is true whether you're a detailed planner or a fellow traveler, someone who discovers the story as they go. The book you have written is never the book you set out to write. At the start, everything gets thrown in. We describe every gesture, every look, every sunset, and every cup of coffee. We give everyone an enormous backstory, unsure whether their miserable Christmas in 1982 or their student job in the fast food joint will come to be the secret that unlocks their fate. This is particularly true of genres like fantasy and science fiction, where you're building an entire world from first principles. Does the number of moons matter? The system of government? Whether people generally believe in ghosts or gods or prophets? But once we have a draft, we can begin to answer these questions. That's what editing is. When we build, we use scaffolding to hold everything together, to allow progress without collapse, to allow us to reach the heights. But when a building is finished, you take the scaffolding away. You take away all the leftover materials, all the rubble, all the things that weren't needed in the end. You tidy up, leave it pristine for whoever will inhabit it. That's editing. Your character's teacher's backstory may be fascinating to you, but the teacher ended up being less of a key character than you thought. So now their hinterland isn't really relevant. It's left over, not useless, just extra. If books had bonus content the way DVDs used to, then it could be sent there, but they don't. Maybe they should. There's no return from the cutting room floor in fiction. That's why we are brutal in our language. Kill your darlings, hack them out. They are flab, fat, excess. Get trim, tight, strong, lean. This is the language we use. Eradicate, exterminate. But is that right? Is that the end? We need to be utilitarian, sure, for the greater good. But when you take the scaffolding away from a building, when you tidy up the timber and bricks and cement, you don't set fire to them. So why are we encouraged to do that in writing? There's something icky about a writer reusing, repurposing, something perhaps about seeing the sausages being made. I remember being at university studying W.H. Auden. Auden rewrote, recycled, repurposed poems across his life. 1st of September 1939 being a famous example. This is an extract from the Guardian article about it. Auden used things again and again and again. Look at the language the journalist uses. Hack, destroy, dismemberment, death. He calls it a zombie poem. Auden did this with many poems, returning to them, never quite happy with them. He took lines out of one poem, put them into another poem. He rewrote and rewrote and rewrote. At the time, when I was at university, when I was 21, I felt there was something faintly dirty about this. Our tutor described this process as Auden never being able to move on. We felt it was somehow a failure of him as an artist to grow, to change, to continue to be original and think up new ideas. It's a strange dynamic, the civilian assumption that in some art forms, originality is the peak, while in others, we want the familiar. Joni Mitchell complained that at her shows, people just kept calling for the famous hits, Big Yellow Taxi, Both Sides Now, The Circle Game, while she wanted to play her latest songs. Neil Young disappointed his fans on his Tonight's the Night tour by playing only songs from that new album, even though it hadn't been released yet. Finally, at the end of each set, he'd announce, "Here's one you've heard before," then launch into the title track for the second time that night. Joni Mitchell pointed out that no one ever shouted to Van Gogh, "Paint the Starry Night again, man." We want our artists, but not our musicians, moving forward. And there's something about Auden returning to the same poems again and again that we find distasteful. The text is sacrosanct. I do think the text should be sacrosanct in a way once it's been published. Writers are never satisfied with their earlier work. When out-of-print works come back into print, it's almost impossible to avoid the urge to rewrite, rework, in light of how our skills have developed over the years. I know quite a few writers who have republished their debut novel and rewritten huge sections of it. I'm never quite sure how I feel about that. There's the text you love, but then the flaws are taken away. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it different? It's something I've never really understood. With unpublished work, there's even less of a need, I think, to stop fiddling. No one's ever going to see the early versions of unpublished things, but there has to be a point where you go, enough. I know one writer who spent 25 years rewriting the same novel in the hope that this time, with the latest feedback, it would get published. He couldn't let it go. He'd have been so much better just putting it aside and pouring everything he'd learned into a new novel, but he couldn't do it. It was precious, too precious to give up on. However, I want to argue for not killing your darlings. For the greater good, absolutely, but kill, as in delete forever, stay thy hand. My first novel was called Sometimes Sleep, and it has never and will never be published. But there was an idea in it, a scene where high school students took over a building on campus, occupied it to make a stand against authoritarianism, fascism, a whole host of isms, but bullying mostly. It didn't work in that book and came out, and in the end, that book didn't work at all. But the scene stayed with me. These students barricaded in the library, youthful rebellion, left-wing politics, action and talk, side by side. I returned to it in a fantasy novel I wrote called Dog Mountain, again, unpublished and will remain that way. It didn't work there either, because as the story developed, the characters' politics changed and they would have been outside the library trying to get in, not behind the barricades. Again, I tossed my precious aside. It was recycled again in a novel called The Fortune Keepers that is unpublished, but hopefully not for long this time. It's out with agents and things now. The library scene is substantially the same as before, but with the names, pronouns, times changed, was in the first draft of that book. It isn't there now. That's because it's already been published in this, my latest book, Life is Elsewhere, Burn Your Flags. This is the start of the scene. So that scene, almost in its entirety, has existed for me for nearly 20 years now. It's gone through changes and cycles. It's been in things, come out, been in things and come out. If I'd followed the dictum to kill your darlings, I'd have deleted this a long time ago. And eventually it would have been lost forever. Now it fits perfectly into this new book. Auden called 1st of September 1939 the right poem for the wrong time. This chapter was the right chapter for the wrong book. Last year, while I was drafting this, it became the right chapter for the right book. It fitted perfectly with everything else I was writing about in that book. It fits with the character. It fits with the themes. It was there waiting for me to lift and drop into place. And now, if I had never mentioned it, no one would ever have noticed the joins. Don't kill your darlings. Don't destroy your precious. Save them. A good idea is always a good idea. And from an offcut, new plants can grow. However, as I said, this recycling, this reusing can seem faintly unreputable, showing the sausage being made. I worried about it even while I was doing it. Am I cheating? Is this self-plagiarism? One of the jokes about Murakami Haruki is Murakami bingo. It's from the New York Times. You can bet a new Murakami novel will have some combination of cats, quirky women that tend to lack agency, jazz or classical music, and spaghetti. That Murakami returns to these themes, these archetypes, is seen as a failing by many, an inability to move on, a failure of imagination. In academia, self-plagiarism is a crime. But how about in fiction? In published work, it attracts criticism for sure, as this Guardian article shows. In the Comedian pod style, I worried about this. Does it make me an imposter that I have cut and pasted a scene from an unpublished book X and used it in published book Y? I mean, I did it anyway, but I worried about it. Then, in May last year, I did an event at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan in Tokyo, and I had a conversation with the Swiss journalist, Christoph Neidhardt. He was talking about this man, Per Olof Enquist, the Swedish author, about whom I had never heard. One of the failings I am most aware of being British, and there are many, is a lack of knowledge about the literature of the rest of Europe. We assume English literature is the pinnacle, and we are quite happy remaining inside that bubble where very little ever gets published. It seems less so in the rest of Europe. This Swiss journalist was well versed in Swedish literature, Danish and German literature too, it turned out. It was the kind of conversation that makes me feel inadequate, and I vowed to do something about it. But it was something specific he said in that conversation that felt like an earthquake for me. He spoke of Enquist, a man he had met, a man he knew well, and his theory of autocomposting. Told you would return to it. At first hearing autocomposting sounded like something environmentally friendly to do with yourself after death. Autocomposting, Neidhardt told me, is the idea of recycling and reusing, of connections flowing through your work across your writing career. Everything goes on the compost heap, and out of it, fresh green things grow. I know this, I thought at the time. I just didn't know there was a name for it. The next day, I emailed Neidhardt to ask for more information. There is not much out there. Enquist spoke about compost aesthetic, as it is in Swedish. I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it. I do not speak Swedish. Compost aesthetic, but seems rarely to have written about it. There are some references in Swedish behind paywalls, a passing note in German. The only thing either of us could find in English was this fleeting mention of it in an interview. Let's leave that there and let you read it. He refers to it a couple of times. Sometimes I reuse material. I've created a new type for literary historians to study called compost aesthetic. And in the same book, he says, what I can see is that there are connections between my books. That's what I sometimes call compost aesthetic, sometimes opening doors between rooms. Neidhardt told me that Enquist said to him that he called it auto-composting. when they spoke, or perhaps self-composting. The Swedish can be translated as compost aesthetic, and I like that a lot. Writers have obsessions, things they return to, themes, topics, questions. This isn't the realm of academia. We're aware of it. Sorry, this isn't the realm of academics. We're aware of it ourselves. For years, it haunted me, this fear that I was unoriginal, that I was recycling, reusing, that I had to wipe the slate clean after each book and never, ever repeat myself. The best kind of advice you can get as an artist is keep doing exactly what you're doing. And here was a celebrated novelist, playwright, journalist, a real European intellectual saying that. Keep doing what you're doing. Recycle, reuse. It's not self-plagiarism. It's something else. It's got a name. It's compost aesthetics. It's auto-composting. Don't throw away. From fresh shit, flowers do grow. Enquist isn't just talking about recycling, though. Well, that is part of it. The reason I could use that scene in a number of different works is that, as he says, there are connections between books, connecting doors of themes, characters, ideas, concerns. Kill Your Darlings tells you to slam those doors shut. Another piece of advice, to draft to the end, to work on one thing and then move on to the next, that slams the doors shut. Enquist's aesthetic, his artistic philosophy, says, no, leave those doors open. Why should it be the sole domain of academics to draw parallels between works, to open those doors connecting novel A with novel B? Why can't the writer be consciously doing it? Is it because we're so immersed in Roland Barthes' ruling that the author is dead? Forget Barthes. He was planting a flag for the reader, justifying his own position. Well, two can play at that game. David Mitchell threw open the doors between his books, recycling characters, creating an uber novel, a universe in which all of his stories take place. Some don't like it because it draws attention to the falsity of the narrative. Others revel in it, trying to find the links. I don't work on that level, at least not yet. I just mean I don't erect barriers between books. I try to process the world and to learn. The subjects of my books are things I don't understand, but want to. They're things I spend a lot of time thinking and reading about before I ever put pen to paper. This brings me to the third piece of advice I want to reject, and the final part of my title, writer's block. The advice is, as James Joyce said in Giacomo Joyce, write it, damn you, write it. What else are you good for? Yes and no. What is writer's block? It's essentially not knowing what to write next. And that being said, writer's block is a direct refutation of Joyce's advice. Writing isn't simply sitting down at a desk in front of a blank piece of paper or an open Word document and putting one word after the other. That's certainly one part of it, a part without which nothing would ever be written, sure. But that's not all there is. The injunction to sit and write makes writers think that if they aren't sitting and typing, then they aren't writing, even that they aren't writers. Writer's block isn't a problem. It's a symptom of an illness caused by this counterproductive advice. Quite simply, if you dispose of the idea that all writing consists of is sitting at a desk, putting one word after the other, then you dismiss the existence of writer's block. Treat the virus, cure the symptoms. There are two ways I've found of doing this. One is simple, accepting that planning and thinking is as important, nay, more important than actually putting words on paper. Sitting down in front of a blank piece of paper and saying, what should I write about today, is madness. I'm writing when I'm driving, when I'm doing the dishes, when I'm in the shower. I'm thinking about characters, thinking about scenes, making connections between subplots. I'm writing when I'm reading, watching films, and listening to podcasts. Example. I'm planning to write a piece at some point in the future, an article, book maybe, I'm not sure yet, on science and ethics. I had my topic and was mulling it while I listened to a podcast about the bombing of Hiroshima on the anniversary. As I listened to it, It sparked a connection between two things I thought were completely unrelated. It opened the door between two works, in Inquist's words, and all of a sudden, the piece blossomed into something new and better. I still haven't written a word, but the flower is growing, blooming, spreading its roots. One day soon, I'll sit down and begin putting words to paper, but the writing process has already started. If I listen to that anxiety-inducing advice, sit down at your desk and write, damn you, I'd have started something before it was ready, and I'd have quickly hit a wall. My latest book, Life is Elsewhere, Burn Your Flags, was drafted in 2 days. It's 80 pages long, 20,000 word novella, written over a weekend. Or so I like to claim, but that is disingenuous. A claim like Kerouac's 3 weeks to write on the road, one that falls down as soon as it's questioned. My new book is about characters I invented in 2015, characters whose backstory I worked out in 2015 and who had been living in my head for 5 years without ever making it onto paper. The right characters at the wrong time. During lockdown, I began wondering how they were getting on with the pandemic, and all of a sudden, I knew their story. The right characters now found their time, and the words poured out. I then spent months editing, but the sit at your desk and write, damn you, bit was done in a brief spurt over a weekend. No writer's block because I didn't force it. I didn't try to write the story until the story was ready to be told. Some of you will be thinking, great, but I don't have the time. I have kids, grandkids, jobs, etc. And yes, I understand that. We all have to squeeze our writing into whatever windows we can. But that just reinforces my point. If you only have an hour of free time to sit at a desk, you've got to make it count. And you can do that by being ready, by having the story ticking over in the back of your mind or in notes, voice memos, whatever works, while you're making the bentos or changing the tires or whatever. So that then when you get your hour before the kids wake up, you're ready to go. Writer's block doesn't exist until you try to jump from no idea to words on a page. It's like wondering why you can't make a cake when you haven't bought all the ingredients yet. Cake block is not a thing. You're just out of flour. Once you have flour, you can start making a cake. The other way I've found to avoid writer's block is to work on multiple projects at the same time. I suspect Suzanne does this as well. Maybe find out later. In fact, I think anyone who appears to be prolific is really a writer who has 17 works in progress on their hard drive. It's another thing you're advised to avoid. Finish things, get the draft done, get it on paper, then you can make it look good. Generally, good advice, but again, not if you're forcing the words to come when they aren't ready. I'm currently 50,000 words into a science fiction novel. I'm also 60,000 words into a travel memoir. I'm editing another travel book and a thriller. I have 2 books at the planning stage and a collection of short stories I've been fiddling with for years. I have a haiku collection with a publisher. The reason for all of this is that I know I have different moods. Sometimes I'm angry and want to rant about the shit state of the world. Sometimes I'm feeling playful and want to invent new worlds and go exploring through the stars. Sometimes I'm feeling introspective and want to explore my own motivations and actions. Sometimes I want to start and finish something quickly, and sometimes I'm just in the mood to edit, not actually write anything new. Whatever my mood, I have a project that fits it. That means whenever I sit down at the desk, there's something I can be getting on with. Today, I'm not sure what's going to happen next in my science fiction novel. I've written the main character into a cell, and now I have to get her out. And I'm not sure which character is going to get to be her hero. But rather than stress about it and try to force it, to give myself anxiety and writer's block, in other words, I'm thinking about neutrinos, industrial accidents and nuclear weapons, and shaping those ideas into a narrative in my head. Again, if I followed conventional advice and put these ideas off until it was their turn, I'd never get to them. This also feeds into Enquist's cross-pollination, his autocomposting. Something I read for my non-fiction work could spark an idea that feeds into something in my science fiction novel. Doors open between work and catalysts fire everywhere. Then one day, one of the books will pass a tipping point and consume me totally. Or I'll get a commission that is close enough to something in the oven, and the deadline will direct my attention that way. So those seemingly useful pieces of advice: kill your darlings, work on something until it's finished, sit down and write it, damn it. 3 pieces that have some utility and tell us something, I actually find counterproductive. It's taken me years to realize this, years to be confident enough to reject the advice, to find my own way. Stuart Goldsmith now has released 383 episodes of the podcast, and he's stopped looking for patterns. His data collection has led him and his listeners to the conclusion that there is no secret, that however you are doing it is the way it should be done. That by trying to do it how other people tell you it should be done is counterproductive. That if you feel like an imposter, that is proof enough that you are not an imposter. I said at the start, creativity, art, is about giving yourself permission to be yourself. Now, I'm going to stop that there. We're at 36. I'm going to stop that there, and I'm going to read you the bit from my novella that was the subject of this, all that mass recycling and things. So it should be fun. I've never read this section aloud, so it might be a bit of a car crash. Yeah, let's start here. All right. My school had the usual gangs and cliques. The main gang was led by this girl, Sakura. Her father was also a politician, much higher, much more powerful than mine. There were 2 sisters, Sakura and Yumemi. Sakura was the bully, Yumemi the weak one. Older and younger, so it goes. Yumemi was in my class. Sakura was 2 years older, a senior while we were in 1st grade. She ran the school, her and her officially sanctioned army, about 20 of them. They all marched around the school, policing. The slightest infringement of rules got you a crack on the head, a jab in the ribs. Like all armies, like all police forces, they were corrupt on the make. Money was extorted, snacks, electronic devices, anything that took their fancy. The authorities smiled on it all. Students cowed by fear are easier to handle. With kids controlling each other, there was less need for teacher involvement, more time for relaxing, more time to concentrate on indoctrination. Sakura was a ringleader, circus master, and we graduated from elementary school into her world. Being friends with Yumemi didn't protect you. It made you a target. Sakura loathed everyone, but she hated her sister most of all. We thought she'd be safe, but actually she was targeted more than the rest of us. Everything from being tripped in the corridor to a head down the toilet to her clothes being stolen during sports. There were no neutrals at that school, but Yumemi was the biggest victim. It was only a matter of time before they went too far. The first day back after the summer vacation, Hiroko Imaeda, the daughter of a diplomat, a nerdy kid who had grown up overseas and struggled with kanji, made the mistake of not immediately surrendering her comic to one of Sakura's goons. With a split skull, broken fingers, and a cracked rib, she left in an ambulance and never came back. For a couple of weeks, everything paused. The whole school was suspended in the moment before a roller coaster drops, waiting for something, for Hiroko's father to do something, for the police, for other parents, for anything to happen. A reporter turned up and left with an envelope stuffed with cash. At least that was the rumor. And that was it. If the principal ever spoke to Sakura about it, Yumemi never learned. The school authorities, in their inaction, gave Sakura permission to do what she liked. There was no line she couldn't cross. She was above the law. Yumemi disagreed. She'd liked Hiroko. They liked the same manga and anime, swapped books. Regardless of what the principal thought, we all knew something had to be done. Sakura would graduate to high school the following April, but at that age, 6 months is a lifetime. Yumemi decided to take a stand. We couldn't fight back with violence, we'd lose. But there was one thing school valued above all else: its reputation. It was remarkably easy to take over the library, she laughs, grinds out the cigarette. It occupied the whole top floor of the main tower and was ideal. We were alone and able to see in every direction. There were only 2 doorways and no one above. We got both the librarians into the elevator, hands tied behind their backs. Yumemi explained what we were doing to those who were in the library studying, and only a handful opted to leave with the staff. We barricaded the doors with bookshelves, jammed the elevators open, and smashed the vending machines to provide sustenance for the long struggle ahead. We pulled posters off the wall and emptied the stationery cupboard looking for anything to make banners with. Down with fascism, no more violence, and justice for Imaeda. Yumemi made a series of signs personally insulting Sakura, calling into question her chastity, accusing her of bedwetting, being a whore. Over the days that followed, Yumemi wrote a series of leaflets outlining the more embarrassing moments of Sakura's childhood and dropped the defamatory confetti on the students and staff below. After years of abuse, she had turned the tap on and there was no turning it off. It was my awakening too. I started reading anything I could find in the library on struggle, on rebellion. We needed educating, and fast. We needed a manifesto, a framework, an ideology. I learned about the almost revolution of the 60s, about how our parents took to the streets, and then when it was all over, took jobs in the system they swore to smash. The first day and night were fun. It was probably the only time the library heard that much laughter. As we outlined strategy for the struggle, making lists of demands, fleshing out arguments, we were all in high spirits. We held the library for 5 days. After the first night, the tension dissipated. A few of the girls made a domino rally out of books, quite a spectacular one, up and down the furniture, in and out of cupboards, through shelves. We found a deck of cards. Someone started a competition to see who could find the funniest line in the book. You opened it at random and read the first sentence you saw. That lasted about 10 minutes. No one won. I kept reading, started writing down quotes and dropping them out the window, made speeches no one could possibly hear. I soon grew tired, retreated to the history section, and set about defacing and rewriting all the books I disagreed with. As boredom increased, morale fell. The vending machines held little choice. Some began to regret remaining and discussed leaving. The rest of us talked them out of it. In the end, no one left, but the idea infected everyone and reduced morale further. Most of our entertainment came from watching the crowd outside. We'd brought the school to a standstill, and with nothing better to do, our schoolmates stood looking up at us. There were brief bursts of excitement, like when Sakura and her gang attacked the barricades. They battered the doors with baseball bats and metal rods, heaved their weight against it. Looked like they might break through, but the stairwell was narrow and the shelves heavy. They just couldn't get enough weight into the push, and it would have taken a month to break the fire containment doors down. In the end, they resigned themselves to detailed descriptions of what they would do when we finally came out. We had to come out sometime. The staff had no intention of negotiating. We later found out the principal had gone golfing. Eventually, they had to put their public image to one side in the hope of a solution. The police were called in, and with them, the reporters. The sight of police cars pulling into the playground raised anxiety levels a few notches, but it also made us kind of proud. We were being taken seriously. It was the closest we came to victory. The story of Imaeda and the bullying couldn't be kept secret anymore. Our parents initially kept their distance from the whole thing, so many of them with reputations to think about. But once the details of how the school was being run and exactly what had happened to Imaeda emerged, sympathy shifted. Even those who approved of rigid discipline, enforced physically if necessary, felt things had gone a little far. The golf didn't help. Of course, we didn't know this at the time. We just knew we were getting hungry and tired, bored and frustrated and worried. We were all going to be in serious trouble when this was over, with our parents, with the school, with the police. There was no way it could end well. The end finally came after a night without power or water. When we realized the toilets wouldn't flush, we pretty much gave up. The smell was revolting. We didn't announce our exit, just quietly got into the elevators and appeared suddenly before the cameras. We could see Sakura itching to get at us, but they'd been warned by the principal not to do anything while the police and the cameras were there. As we passed, Sakura waved at her sister. We were all immediately arrested, though Yumemi managed to make a statement to the cameras about smashing fascism, pleading for justice for Umaida. The rest of us meekly got into the police cars, keeping our heads down, avoiding the limelight. I'll stop that there. I don't want to give away the very end of that section. Where are we? 1:45. All right, I will stop there, I think. So thank you very much for listening. And now is the time for questions, should you have any.
There are a couple questions. There are comments and questions in the chat if you want to look through those. It's just the last 4 things or so that are your session.
All right, so Krishnan says, compost aesthetic is very common in filmmaking. They're well accepted by cinephiles. I did not know that. That's interesting. In fact, many look forward to spotting them in new releases. I can't understand why that is an issue in the literary world. Yeah, there's a slight difference, I think, between compost aesthetic and like Easter eggs and that kind of thing, which happens in movies a lot. That is part of it, and it's fun putting little bits when, you know, David Mitchell especially has characters that appear again and again. I think where it causes problems, or certainly like that Guardian article I flagged up briefly, where that focuses on is like entire scenes or chapters or things looping back again and again. What seems to be a writer not using something, not being original, just reusing the same thing as a kind of cut and paste shortcut is how it's often viewed. Which, as I say, I can't decide where I come down on, despite the fact that I do it myself on occasion. But yeah, that's a good point about cinema, though. I will read a bit more about that. So thank you for your comment. So Arthur says, I've never considered Kill Your Darlings to be mutually inclusive with delete this idea forever and never use it for any other work. It's not, but it can be taken that way. And I've had people tell me that, you know, it's delete, 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 take it out, which implies get rid of it. It's trash. It's gone forever. And I'm by no means saying that everybody does this, and, you know, people don't. Lots of other people do keep things and recycle things. Yeah, I just kind of want to highlight that sometimes the two get conflated a bit, and that I think is problematic, because it can cause anxiety in people that are thinking, you know, as I say, I work as a professional editor, and I deal with most of my clients are people whose work has been rejected by a lot of publishers and agents, and they want to know why, they want to know how to fix it. So they're already in quite a negative place psychologically when I'm working with them. And a lot of that is from these kind of things. I've been going, you know, I don't want to delete this. I don't want to throw it out. You know, I've spent so much time on it, which, you know, as writers is something we all know. And yeah, I kind of want to say, like, don't just cut and paste it into a different Word file and keep it. It's the right sentence, but the wrong time, or the right scene and the wrong time. So yeah, it can mean delete. I mean, sometimes it's just bad, in which case it can go. But yeah, cool. A lot of comments. Thank you for the nice comments.
Okay, I think we need to wind down. And I want to give everybody just a chance to thank Iain for his presentation. That was very thoughtful. I found it really interesting. And I think that the whole thing about, if you feel like an imposter, you probably aren't, or, that you don't have to delete it. You can have an outtake file, and it frees you, these kinds of things, as a writer. So yeah, really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as I say, ignore everything I said. It's all advice, so ignore it.
So we're going to have another presentation in 10 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for now.